our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, Truth Seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. You know, it's really been a week here in the U.S. with a ton of news mostly relating to politics and the economy. And one thing that newsmakers will do is when they're facing criticism for one thing, they do something buzzy in another area. And honestly, I feel like I've just been seeing them having one thing playing off another, kind of alternating. And it's been interesting to see people who are criticizing the media for covering one thing and not covering another. And if you've listened to the podcast for a while, you know that one of the big problems is just the staffing. These organizations are running very lean right now, and they don't always have the resources to just cover everything. So it's really hard. But I thought this week we might take a bit of a break from news and politics and talk about a different thing that actually does relate to politics a little bit: news and religion. So we're going to talk about why religion is an important thing to report on, why journalists sometimes do a pretty bad job of covering it, and why that matters, in some cases even ending people's lives. Sound good? Let's get unspun. Even if you're not religious, you should know that religion affects a lot of parts of our lives. It matters in politics, it matters in international relations, it matters inside communities. And for the media, reporting about a religion isn't just about explaining what different types of people believe. It's also about understanding how what they believe might influence how they act, who they vote for, how they treat other people, and it can explain some of the events all over the world. But reporting on religion accurately can be really hard. So to illustrate this, I want to look at an event from the 1980s that was known as the Satanic Panic. Now, I remember being a child in the U.S. Midwest at that time, and my friends and I were sharing scary stories about what might happen if, say, you were driving down a dark rural highway at night and someone jumped out in front of your car and forced you to stop. And then they would drag you out and carry you off into the woods for some horrible Satan-related ritual. I can tell you that during that time, people became convinced that there were secret groups practicing satanic rituals that in particular were harming children. Now, this was rumors, but the media contributed to it, which increased the fear that the public had. Let's listen to a short excerpt from a local news report. Pay attention to the way that they're presenting the information.
This is connected to devil worship. That's the focus tonight of Lonnie Lardner's special report on Satanism. But we want to warn you now that some things you're about to see and hear might be too graphic for children. Lonnie.
Well, Terry, authorities tell us that the most serious or perhaps the most dangerous kind of devil worship comes in the form of underground cults. Most of them are very secretive, usually organizing clandestine rituals in the dark of night. Well, those ceremonies sometimes involve the sharing of animal blood to gain power, they say, but cult members believe their strength really comes from secrecy.
The most common thing in an adolescent murderer, for example, is having been abused, having been sexually molested or assaulted as a child. And very often these youngsters will turn that around and assault little children or animals. They'll torture, torment, kill.
When kids will do their sacrificing and their animal mutilation, they'll do it within a pentagram. They'll put black candles on each of the points of the pentagram, a grill over the top, and allow the blood to drip into some kind of container because they use it for bathing in or drinking.
Initially, these kind of stories were local, like this one was, but eventually major news outlets started reporting it too, and they didn't really verify the facts. This fear became pretty widespread, and innocent people were sometimes accused of things, and it was really pretty disruptive in some places. So I feel like this issue, which probably honestly is related a little bit to some of the QAnon conspiracies that we hear today, It just underscores how important it is to have careful reporting about religion. Religious reporting intersects with a bunch of different areas, including politics, as in why there aren't leaders doing anything, or perhaps leaders who are the ones who are doing bad things. It intersects with education in some cases, it intersects with social justice, and it intersects, unfortunately, with crime. When reporters don't understand the religious aspects of a story, this can create misinformation about entire groups of people, and that can sometimes have really bad consequences. So accurate religious reporting can actually help improve understanding between different groups. And as societies globally are becoming more diverse because of immigration, accurately covering religion is especially important. One of the things that makes me think about this is the coverage of campus protests about Gaza, and the fact that some college campuses are now facing defunding, or in the case of Columbia in New York, possibly a government takeover, because of accusations of antisemitism. As I see the stories that are covering this right now, most of them are event-type stories. Either a government or an official issues a press release or holds a press conference, and the fact that the press release was issued or that the press conference was held is covered, and it's the things that are said by the government official. In this case, the accusation that the protests on campus were anti-Semitic. Now, anti-Semitism has a history of some consequences that are perhaps the most tragic we've ever seen in humanity. And there's some evidence that at some schools, the actions of protesters did negatively affect Jewish students. Some of them reported feeling unsafe on their campuses, and that's not okay. However, couldn't it be true that most of the protesters were objecting to actions by the Israeli government and not by Jewish people? Is it not possible to both think that the attack on Israel and the response in Gaza were bad? Both were bad. Condemning is not necessarily an endorsement of the other. These kind of questions are not really getting covered in the stories. They're religion questions. And when the media falls down on covering the religion aspects, it can cause a lot of suffering. So what are some of the challenges in covering religion? The first one for sure is religious illiteracy on the part of journalists. Lots of reporters do not fully understand the basic facts about religion. I can tell you it is not at all required for journalists to have training in understanding world religions as a part of their education if they go to journalism school. You can choose to take a course, but it's definitely not expected. And so, because we live in a society where the amount of comparative religious education that may come up in public school varies a lot around the country, we have a lot of people who don't know much at all about people of faith, or who only understand their own faith. So, for example, a journalist might use the term, quote, evangelist, meaning a preacher, when they intended to say evangelical, referring to a type of Protestant Christian. Or they could incorrectly pronounce names, or get titles wrong, for example, calling Sikhs sheikhs, which gets their identity completely wrong. And all of this has impacts. For example, there is a branch of evangelical Christianity, a subgroup of Protestants who practice what is called prosperity theology. Prosperity theology basically says that if you do things that are pleasing to God, God will reward you with success in life, and often this equals money. And there is a widespread public belief that most Christians believe this, and that's wrong. Many Christians don't remotely believe that, and they think that is a bad understanding of Christian holy writings. Another example could be misunderstanding of Judaism. When most of the stories you see are about Judaism intersecting with world events, like when you saw ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York who did not want to get vaccinations, it can shape your view about what a large group of people think, when in fact there are many different types of Jews and a whole spectrum of beliefs. I think you get the idea. Reporters tend to be rather illiterate when it comes to the nuances of people's faiths. Another challenge is that journalists definitely bring their own biases to their reporting about people's beliefs or the assumptions that they make, and this affects what stories get reported at all or the way in which they're reported. So, for example, you see a lot of stories focusing on negative events involving religion. These are important stories, like ones about church leaders abusing children. Stories on religious groups like the Southern Baptist Convention will often report on policy issues that intersect with social issues, such as the role of women in ministry. But media coverage is less often about positive contributions from religious organizations, which do run important charitable works and community support programs all over the world. So whether it's a Buddhist temple in Thailand offering food to the needy, or a Muslim community center or faith-based Christian after-school program, people of faith also do good things. This kind of selective reporting can reinforce the negative views that people have. Covering religion is really hard because it deeply connects to people's identities and beliefs. Those are hard to explain under the best of circumstances, and when you need to simplify it into a headline, or even in a longer story or piece, that can lead to a lot of misunderstandings. So for example, Islam has significant differences in the way people practice it and the way it shows up in cultures all over the world. There are Muslim-majority countries where, for example, women don't really show much of their body, and others where women never show their hair, and in still others, women don't cover their hair at all. After you finish listening to UnSpun today, go to your favorite search engine and do an image search for Muslim woman. I think you'll see what I mean when I say that there are stereotypes that don't represent the entire variety of women in Islam. Good journalism requires not just understanding particular religious practice or rituals, but also understanding the cultural context and the historical backgrounds. The way that news frames religion definitely influences how people perceive people of faith. So for example, if news coverage about Islam highlights terrorist attacks and doesn't give context, it can lead the audience to associate the religion with violence. Balanced reporting would require giving context, emphasizing that the vast majority of Muslims oppose terrorism. Here's an example from recent history. In 2012, Mitt Romney, a Mormon, ran for president. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not frequently covered, or definitely had not been at that time, and so lots of journalists didn't get into what the group actually believes, or they depicted Mormonism inaccurately. Let's listen to a brief clip discussing Romney's Mormon faith.
Mormonism was created by a guy in upstate New York in 1830 when he got caught having sex with the maid and explained to his wife that God told him to do it. 48 wives later, Joseph Smith's lifestyle was completely sanctified in the religion that he invented to go with it, which Mitt Romney says he believes.
Later, a political commentator had to go back and apologize for these remarks. They were a biased and massively overly simplified statement on the origin of a group of faithful people. Because Romney's faith was an issue for some voters, it deserved a thoughtful treatment in the media, because this helps people who are not familiar understand an issue they might or might not choose to be concerned about. So as you can see, personal bias can shape public views about religious groups. Another issue is that sometimes covering religion means physical danger for journalists. In countries with a strongly religious culture, reporters who critically write about religious groups or who expose abuses can actually be attacked. For example, journalists who are reporting on minority abuses in countries like Myanmar have been threatened or in some cases even exiled. Another issue is one that is really everywhere in journalism, which of course is resources. About the time that I graduated and started working, it was fairly common for medium to large-sized news outlets to have religion specialists on their staff. These are people whose beat was religion, and this started going away about that time in the late 1980s, and the slide has definitely continued. Religious specialists might have had more training, but even if they didn't, because they consistently covered faith communities, they had a chance to develop regular sources and to kind of have those sources educate them as they continued to do their job. It added a level of nuance to religion reporting that has really gone away. What happens now is that when you have a story with a religion angle, it'll usually be covered by either a general assignment reporter, who's someone who handles various topics without a deep level of knowledge in any of them, or it will be covered by the reporter who covers the intersecting beat. So for example, if you're covering Christian nationalism, that will often get covered by the politics team. And that definitely tends to influence how the story comes out. A politics reporter is going to tend to see and foreground the political aspects, which may mean leaving out important aspects of the theology that really do matter. Because reporters don't have a chance to develop sources on a religion beat, you also run into issues with distrust. I mean, think about it. Who are the people who are turning around and booing at TV cameras during rallies likely to be? When you're an ultra-Orthodox Jew, who you think was covered unfairly in a public health story about vaccination, do you really want to pick up the phone when another reporter calls you? Building trust within a community really takes patience, and it also takes respectful communication. But most of all, it takes consistency. And that consistency is often lacking now that we have few religion specialists. This matters. For example, in 1996, an evangelical leader named Paul Crouch was speaking at a rally at the Capitol and said, quote, "Let's pray God will slay everyone in the Capitol." The Washington Post reported this as him calling for the death of everyone in government. But slay is a special word in Crouch's Pentecostal religion, basically meaning being taken over and consumed by the Spirit of God. When you report that as violence, you're not doing a great job of covering that faith group. And even when journalists are people of faith, that can be a problem, because if they're personally devout, they may be considered to be unobjective. So, for example, a devout Muslim covering Islam might be challenged about whether they can stay neutral. On the other hand, they probably would also have more insights. In newsrooms where the staff does have a religious background, if it's not religiously diverse, it can also skew coverage. So, for example, if you are a tiny news organization and everyone on the staff is Christian, which was true of the first place where I worked, it can influence the way stories are picked and how they're told. So an important story about a Hindu festival, for example, could just be ignored because the people who are covering it don't understand it. Journalists also sometimes have unconscious biases that can affect the way they cover religious groups. But often, it's just that reporters don't really know about religious diversity. Just about every major religion contains really diverse groups and interpretations. You know, there's a difference between a Theravada Buddhist in Thailand and a Won Buddhist in Korea. There's a difference between a Reformed Jew and an Orthodox Jew. In order to be accurate, coverage really needs to reflect that diversity instead of presenting a religion as a single uniform community. And at the same time, society has become more divided. And that means that religious topics have become really politically charged. It's always been the case that people would have an uneasy relationship with the journalists that cover them. I remember myself as a very, very junior reporter in a little town I worked in, which had 2 Christian women's meetup groups, the Christian Women's Club and the Women Aglow. The little newspaper that I worked for would run a community events column, and I would actually get comments from people based on if Women's Aglow was a higher bulleted point in the list than Christian Women's Club 2 weeks in a row. There are questions of fairness that can be particular to religious groups, and it is really challenging to tread between those. I need to take a quick break. When I come back, we'll talk about the news values that exist in religious stories and some more specifics about how they affect society. I'll be right back. Welcome back. We've talked before on UnSpun about traditional news values, things like conflict and prominence and impact. Those news values do affect what religion stories get chosen. For example, news outlets have covered sex abuse scandals in the Southern Baptist and Catholic churches because of impact. The impact that those crimes have on the lives of children is significant and important. At the same time, celebrity can also matter. A statement by the Pope or a controversy with a well-known pastor is much more likely to receive attention than a statement from the imam of a tiny Muslim community in a southern town. Another important news value is the impact of a religious event on society or culture or politics. So when faith leaders come together to lay hands on a political figure, that turns out to be an important story because those religious beliefs might influence political decisions and even election outcomes. Sometimes the choice of what to run or not depends on editorial decisions in the newsroom. A lot of newsrooms either have a news director or an editor who decides which stories are assigned or prioritized. And if those editors are religiously illiterate, which is common, they can just dismiss religion stories, assuming that the audience must not be interested either. And so an editor might decide against covering a religious group's help after a natural disaster, thinking that readers aren't interested in religion. But conflict is interesting, so if religion intersects with a prominent issue like politics, that story is more likely to show up. And then some religious groups are really good at promoting themselves, and others are less good at it. Evangelical Christians have often been great at promoting themselves in the media, because theologically, they believe that any tool for them to promote the gospel is a good tool for them to use. Other groups, like Orthodox Christians, are pretty bad at promoting themselves in the media. So after you do your search for Muslim women, you can compare the websites for Orthodox congregations and evangelical congregations. Evangelical congregations tend to have sleek websites with the most modern technology, and I've seen Orthodox websites that look like they stopped in the late 1990s. Because there are a few dedicated religious reporters now, that means that there are fewer people following faith groups just to see what is new. So, faith groups that are better at promoting themselves, at sending press releases or video news releases, they tend to be the ones who get more coverage because that coverage is easier to do with a small staff. So why does this matter? Well, the way that religious stories are framed and which stories get covered affects how people understand other people, particularly as people of faith. When all the stories you hear about a particular religion are associated with violence, you start assuming that is the nature of the religion itself. If you're only talking about the extremists, you start associating the entire religion with extremism. For example, many Jews protested the bombings in Gaza. There are entire Christian organizations that support the separation of church and state. And there are many Muslim leaders who have spoken out against acts of terrorism. these stories don't end up on top of the news and people misunderstand each other. Now, don't get me wrong. Journalists do have a really important role in holding religious institutions accountable, just as they do with government or corporations. There are important stories about financing and faith communities and about human rights and faith communities that really matter to the broader society. But we can imagine a TV reporter tasked with covering a Muslim community's Ramadan event. Now, if you look up Ramadan with a quick web search, you might get ideas about restrictions and fasting. These are important, but they're not everything. If you had a better understanding of Islam, you would know that Ramadan also includes acts of charity and acts of reflection and just building community for Muslims. So when you have this simplified reporting that says, hey, your Muslim coworker might be grumpy this week because they're not eating, this can strengthen a negative stereotype about Islam being oppressive. And research shows that the tone of media really does shape public attitudes. So if you have negative news coverage that links certain religious groups to poverty or crime, this can help cultivate negative attitudes in the people who see those stories. And worse than that, that reporting can foster prejudice and influence how the broader community kind of sees this religious group. Perhaps you remember this.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
That, of course, was the 47th president back during one of the debates in 2024. This was the culmination of a wave of disinformation in the election that Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio were stealing and eating people's pets, in part as a part of a ritual for the traditional religion of voodoo. There were videos about this, and they were shared from accounts from folks like Elon Musk. And it made its way through social media and eventually into the speeches of prominent politicians. News stories did debunk the lie, but only from the perspective of local police who did not actually have reports of people's pets disappearing. That belief that eating pets is a part of voodoo didn't really get addressed much in American media, although it did get addressed abroad. Sometimes it's direct like this, but sometimes it's more indirect. The media can also influence the way the public thinks about issues through a process known as priming. This is where they might do something like have a terrorist attack where they extensively highlight that the perpetrator's victim is Muslim. This can cause people to associate Muslims with violence. You saw this happen during the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, where even experts being interviewed on TV right after just began by assuming that the perpetrators of that bombing were Muslim. They were not. It was a white guy from America. Journalists who cover religion from political beats often apply political labels to religion. So they might, for example, call a religious individual a conservative Catholic or a liberal evangelical. This is reinforcing political divisions rather than understanding faith communities. So what are news organizations doing to cover religion better? As we've talked about, over time, specialized religious reporting has gone away. And so, at the same time, mainstream media has changed its focus to what they call hard news related to religion. So that's your politics, your conflicts, and your scandals. And then, coverage of faith communities and coverage of people's personal faith experiences has pretty much been shifted over into specialized religious publications. For example, religious news magazines. There are organizations like Religious News Association, which do try to improve media literacy among journalists, and they do stuff like offer training sessions and resources like a religion style book. Digital media has also changed the religious reporting landscape. Although traditional media do still matter, digital platforms let religious leaders and organizations communicate directly with people. This is sometimes used as a source for traditional media, who will look at public statements made on social media by those religious leaders. There's also a growing consensus in news that religious institutions deserve the same scrutiny that politics or business does. So, for example, you're seeing more stories about financial transparency or abuse. And this shows journalism is in some ways treating those institutions more seriously. But religious coverage remains a difficult problem because it does require investment and specialized training to keep journalists religiously literate. But one thing is definitely true. Religion continues to be a very important part of life for a lot of people. And understanding people's faith perspective is really important to understanding the way they see the world and in predicting the kind of decisions and actions they might take. So while it's a hard problem for journalism right now, it's also a worthwhile problem. And as you are reading stories that maybe have a faith dimension, it's worth it for you to think about if the faith aspect of the story is just being mentioned or if it's being explained in some way. If it's not, you as the audience may have to go to some of those more specialized outlets to get an explanation of those religious aspects. And I hope you do. Have a great week, Truth Seekers, and stay sharp. Thanks for getting unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.